Hey everybody, it's Pastor Chris. Hope you're doing fantastic as we continue our series called Black History Makers, looking at the lives and legacies of famous Christians in history so their faith story can inspire your own. Today we're going to learn about a young woman whose name you know, but details of her story you likely don't. Araminta Ross, or Minty, was born sometime between 1815 and 1822. When she was 6 years old, her owner hired her out to a lady named Miss Susan to rock her daughter's cradle while she slept. If the child woke, Minty would be whipped. After one of those whippings, she ran away for 5 days but was caught and whipped again as punishment. But Minty's indomitable spirit was born. Minty's family was sold off one by one to distant plantations, tearing her family apart. But when a trader tried to buy Minty's younger brother, her mother finally resisted. And it was a scene that fashioned a heart of resistance within Minty. When she was 12 years old, she was sent to a dry goods stores to get supplies for the plantation. While there, a man stormed in and yelled at another slave in the store, saying he didn't have permission to leave the field. The slave turned and ran, and the owner yelled for Minty to stop him. She refused, and the overseer threw a 2-pound weight at the runaway, but missed him and struck Minty in the head instead. Because of this, she endured seizures, severe headaches, and narcoleptic episodes for the rest of her life. And each of these episodes would be accompanied by intense visions. Already deeply religious, Minty believed that God spoke to her directly through these visions, and for the rest of her life, her steps would be guided by what she heard from the Lord during these visions. In 1844, she met and married a free black man named John Tubman, and would now forever be known as Harriet Tubman. The couple likely had plans to buy Harriet's freedom, but Harriet felt God leading her in a different direction. She would later explain,
"There was one of two things I had a right to, liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other."
After she learned about a house of a white Quaker abolitionist nearby, she planned her escape, and she sang to her family in the fields one day.
"I'm bound for the promised land. I'm gone."
The message was sent, and everyone knew that Harriet was escaping that night. They put Harriet in a wagon, covered it with a sack, and drove her to the house. On and on, she hopscotched safe houses on the famed Underground Railroad, all the way to the Mason-Dixon line. The morning she crossed into Pennsylvania, she said,
When I found I had crossed that line, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven.
Harriet Tubman found work in Philadelphia and began saving money to buy her family's freedom. But when she learned that her niece and her children were soon to be sold, she couldn't not go back to help them. She risked it all and went back to the plantation to help them escape, this time traveling 60 miles by log canoe. The following spring, she returned again to the plantation to help her younger brother escape. And with each trip, she evaded slave catchers and grew in confidence and ingenuity. She traveled at night. She wore disguises in daylight. She waded in rivers to cover her scent from tracking dogs. She led escapes on Fridays because newspapers wouldn't print the news until Monday. She traveled where slave catchers weren't willing to go, through swamps, risking malaria, typhoid, or yellow fever. And with every trip, she looked to God for insight on when to travel, when to hide. She'd pray, she'd meditate, she'd look to God for visions.
If God set the North Star in the heavens, if He gave me the strength in my limbs, then He meant that I should be free.
Over 11 years, Harriet Tubman helped over 300 slaves escape to freedom, and this earned her the nickname Moses. And every time she led a group of slaves to freedom, they would cross into the promised land, as she called it, and they would kneel in prayer. And despite the best efforts of slaveholders, Harriet Tubman was never captured, and neither were the slaves she guided. Years later, she told an audience,
I was conductor of the Underground Railroad for 8 years, and I can say what most conductors can't say. I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger.
But God wasn't done using Harriet Tubman to lead others to freedom. My favorite story came during the Civil War, When Harriet, who had volunteered to work as a cook and a nurse for the Union Army, eventually was enlisted by Colonel James Montgomery to use her experience from years of traveling through the marshes on the Underground Railroad to conduct an assault on Confederate strongholds along the Combahee River. Harriet led a team of 8 scouts to map out the river, finding the locations of Confederate troops and underwater mines along the river. And they also spread word to the plantations on the river that Union ships were coming to free them in just a few days. On the night of June 1st, 1863, the daring raid began. Under the cover of darkness, she safely led the Union ships past the underwater mines to the shores near the plantations. And the signal was given, and more than 800 slaves came running to the shores, wading into rowboats and boarding the Union ships. When the rowboats reached them, it was a panic as everyone tried to get into the rowboats at once. After the boats were overflowing with people, the throngs of slaves on the shore held onto the rowboats to prevent them from leaving, nearly capsizing them. And the small boats made several trips back and forth until the shores were empty and the Union ship was full. Union soldiers then set the plantations on fire, with millions of dollars of burning crops lighting the night. Harriet describes what she saw.
I'd never seen such a sight. We laughed and laughed and laughed. The women would come aboard with twins hanging around their necks, bags on their shoulders, baskets on their heads with pigs squealing, chickens screaming, young ones squalling.
Harriet, ever the Moses figure, believed that night God gave her a vision of what it was like when the Israelite slaves plundered Egypt during the Exodus. But newspapers the next day recorded how Colonel Montgomery had freed 800 slaves under the guidance of simply a black woman. Harriet Tubman's snub by the newspaper somehow signaled how the rest of her life would proceed after the Civil War. Though she continued her humanitarian work, she was overlooked and denied compensation by the United States government for her military service. Harriet Tubman would die penniless. Quoting Jesus and channeling her Moses-like heart to lead the way for others, her final words were simply,
I go to prepare a place for you.